We'll begin with a prayer. Lord, we yearn for wholeness and unity as a people. You enrich our lives daily with wondrous gifts that each culture and each unique individual brings to our human family. You stand at the door and knock, but we can only open to you if we are willing to welcome all those you call our own. By your grace, give to your church and to each of us the faith and love to be welcoming and the strength to open the door. Amen. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Michael Hillis, Dr. Michael Hillis, who is the current Dean of Education at Cal Lutheran, sitting at my desk that I used to occupy. And we're just so pleased to have him with us today. He's doing a great job at Cal Lutheran. But the reason I invited him here today to take part in this is his area of expertise that he's written about and spoken about quite extensively is multicultural education. He has a few stories about that in a few minutes. But let me give you a little bit of his background. His bachelor's degree is from Western Washington. His master's also from Western Washington in school counseling, and his PhD is from the University of Washington in educational psychology with a specialization in multicultural education, cognition, and development. He's been dean now at Cal Lutheran for 3 years, and he came from Pacific Lutheran, so he
Those Lutherans.
Those Lutherans, yes.
Get their claws in you.
Yes. He's also a part of a group, a national group called Deans for Impact, and it's a group of leaders who are committed to transforming educator preparation and elevating the teaching profession. And they advocate a collective vision for change that's informed by data and focused on outcomes. So we're really pleased that he's joined us today on Mother's Day. And we're going to open with a reading.
So thank you for allowing me to be here, and thank you, Carol, for that introduction. I'm going to read the parable of the Good Samaritan because I think it helps frame some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. And so let me lead off here with that. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied, "and how do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Well, you've answered correctly," Jesus said. "Do this and you'll live." But he wanted to justify himself. Don't we all like to do that? But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down to Jerusalem, or from Jerusalem to Jericho. And when he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put a man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for an extra expense you may have.' Now, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise."
And now, a contemporary retelling of this story. An elderly man, shabbily dressed, was headed to the Oaks Mall when he was attacked by a gang of thugs. an elder of the church, a very distinguished person, was hurrying to meet a likely donor to the church's building fund, and didn't want to stop. In fact, he made a wide circle around the injured man who was lying on the ground. And then a local politician came by, shaking his head over the problem of homeless individuals sleeping on the ground, and passed him by as well. Then came along a Hispanic gardener who assisted him, bound up his wounds, and called 911. Who was neighbor? Go and do thou likewise. The purpose of our session today is to explore together the ELCA social statement on race, ethnicity, and culture. You should have a copy of the full statement here in the materials I handed out. Is there anybody who didn't get a set? We're going to loosely use this as a guide today in discussing the issues that are outlined there. You should also have a set of Bible study guide that goes with it. We're not going to get to all the passages here today. It's something for you to take home and reflect on, but you should have a copy of that as well. And the next thing you have is a letter from Colleen Wyndham Hughes, who is our presenter next week, and she's going to discuss the issue of women in justice. And that session will be quite interesting, and I think you'll enjoy that, but it's being even more interesting if you are able to access the materials that she indicates here on this sheet. Okay, we're going to discuss race, gender, and culture and today, and when you look at us, two white privileged individuals, you may wonder, well, why are we presenting on this topic? So I'm going to ask Mike to address that issue.
Okay, I get the easy question. Why us? It's actually, frankly, it's a great question, and to be honest, I don't have a real sufficient answer, I think, to that question, because I think there's plenty of other people that could be up here doing the same thing. But I want to tell a bit of a story to provide a little bit of context about my own background that may give you some insight into this question. When I started my doctoral degree at the University of Washington, I was very quickly looking around for how I was going to make my way through it and connect with the right people. And one of the gentlemen who taught at the University of Washington was a gentleman by the name of Jim Banks. Jim Banks is actually a professor. He just retired, 49 years at the University of Washington. And he is considered to be the father of multicultural education. I was interested in the issues of culture and race and ethnicity for lots of reasons, and it became my academic focus. And so through my persistence of showing up at his door and asking for meetings and taking his courses, I eventually was hired by him to be his research assistant for the Center for Multicultural Education. It was a wonderful opportunity, a great honor to do that. As part of our work, we were working as a team to create a series of papers that explored the historical foundations of the field of multicultural education. I happened to be asked to write a couple chapters, one of them specifically on the history of race and race studies in the United States. And so as part of that work, he asked if I'd be willing to present with him at a national conference in New Orleans. Now, again, at this point, I'm in my late 20s. I'm still trying to figure out my footing in the academic world, a little bit intimidated by all of it, to be honest. Never presented at a national conference, didn't know what a national conference was even supposed to be like. And so I showed up, and this was this is considered kind of the preeminent educational research organization in the country, and AERA, American Educational Research Association. And it has 10 to 15,000 people that attend this conference. It's a large conference. And oftentimes when you, which I've subsequently learned, I didn't know it at the time, oftentimes when you go to conferences, you're presenting in front of 5 people, which are usually 3 others or other presenters, you know, so it's like, it's kind of a funny thing, not very intimidating. Well, this one was going to be a panel discussion, and because of the person I was presenting with, Jim Banks, he drew a crowd. And so we show up, and there's probably over 200 people there. Standing room only. I don't really know what to expect, but I prepared well, and so I launch into my talk about the history of race and race studies in the United States, and prejudice specifically. And I get through it, goes well, and I'm breathing deeply now. You know, I've made it through. And at the end of the presentation, Jim opens it up for questions. And the first question that comes is from a woman sitting in the front row, and she directs it to me. And she says, so I'm curious, how do you see your role as a white male talking about issues of culture? Well, I wasn't quite ready for that question. And I started thinking, what can I say, what can I say? And thankfully I didn't have to answer because Jim, who ended up being my mentor, jumped in and said, I'll tell you why. The reason he is presenting is in order for us to move the needle on race and ethnicity and cultural discussions in our country and within the field of education specifically, we have to have all people involved. And he said, so I look for allies that I think can help advance the conversation, and so I chose him to be part of that. And I just remember thinking, escaped that one. So why us? I mean, I think part of it is, from my own standpoint, is this is something that I care passionately about. And I just find the question of race and ethnicity and culture as being preeminent in helping us really begin to understand each other and to move forward with a lot of the things that we're dealing with as a country, as a society, as a world. So as we start, I want to take a moment just to briefly define some of these terms, because these terms get a little fuzzy, to be honest. When we talk about race, anybody want to just jump out and say, this is what I think race is? How would you define that?
National Geographic said it doesn't exist.
You read that article. Do you remember what the thesis of that was?
I don't.
Okay. So that's one definition. It doesn't exist.
What's on
What
your
about
driver's
just a comment?
license?
Pardon?
What's on your driver's license?
It's okay, so it is a categorization, right?
Oftentimes in medical office,
Well-
needs to use it.
Okay,
Be asked,
okay,
you know, what their
uh-huh,
race or ethnicity is.
yep,
On most national surveys, they ask the question, what is your race? Also on the population survey throughout every 10 years.
yep,
That's a question,
right.
and everybody answers it sort of based upon their
Mm-hmm,
looks as well as their somewhat culture.
mm-hmm. Yeah, so the census is actually a really good example, right? Because those have not been static categories. We had a new category that was added at the last census. Do you remember what the new category was?
Citizenship.
Multiracial,
Yeah.
right? And so that's one of the fastest growing categories. One of the things I'm really interested, how many people have done your DNA testing? Good? Okay. One of the things, and I haven't done it, so you have to tell me, but one of the things I've heard is that when you do that, you see the multi-racial or category that's your heritage.
Or lack thereof, because it's kind of, mine's like white, Northern European, basic, nothing.
Okay?
Generic.
Generic. I got a story about that. I'll tell you about generic. Yeah, so one of the questions that actually gives rise to, though, in terms of that multiracial, is when we talk about race, most people who study this for a living would say it actually doesn't exist. It exists as a social construct, okay? And when we talk about social construct, what we're talking about is it's something that we create, but it doesn't necessarily have any really clear tie to anything that you can defend scientifically, okay? So does everybody see that distinction? And one of the ways that you can see this is that when we talk about, let's say, the race of white, one of the things that's really fascinating when you look at that historically, the white race has been very expansive. And so when the Irish first came, they weren't considered white. Southern Europeans were also not considered white. The Italians, the Greeks, the Spaniards, okay? Now we kind of, come on in, join the party. But that actually gives rise to why it's hard to defend from a scientific basis. A lot of the racial categorizations go back to the mid-1800s when we're trying to classify the world. Remember you're back to your biology courses and they were talking about phylums and kingdoms and all that kind of stuff. Racial categorization started at the same time because we thought, well, if we can do that with all different kinds of living things, maybe we can do this with people as well. And so if you look at some of the very earliest categories of people, it's got some pretty interesting descriptors. Yeah?
Yeah, lots of it, I mean, socially has to do with the dominant race putting down the minority race. I mean, they used to have this, what seems ridiculous and invidious in this day and age, they used to have African Americans passing for white, which sounds so ludicrous. I mean, is it how you see yourself? Is how others see you? I mean, if others see you as white and yet you're black, I mean, that's just insane, and it's just a way to, not just, but it's a way to keep white people up here and black people down there, at least in the past. I mean,
Yeah.
it just, most younger people don't even know about it. They even had movies about that,
Yeah.
about the tragedy of a woman who's African American, but she's white, and then she's found out to be not white, and it's like,
Right. Yeah,
I mean,
there's
it sounds ludicrous now.
Yeah, there's a book written a few years ago. I forget the title, but it was he was the dean of the law school at one of the big schools like Chicago or Yale or something, and he talked about his own background and his parents. He had a white mom and an African-American dad, and he grew up in Northern Virginia, and he grew up as phenotypically, right, so actually what he looked like as a very white person. And the dad basically stayed out of the picture when they were in Northern Virginia, as the mom took the kids and enrolled them in private schools, and they did this, and they had a very nice living for a number of years. And then the mom died, and the dad decided to move them back to his community of Gary, Indiana. which of course is famous for the Jackson 5 and whatnot. And so they moved back there, and then he grew up, and he went on, graduated from high school, but for most of his formative years, grew up in the inner city of Gary, Indiana. And so he wrote a book about this experience, and I saw an interview with him where he's talking to a group of kids that are probably like 8 to 12 years old, and he's having a discussion about race and ethnicity, and he looks at him and he says, he goes, "Now you do know that I'm black." And you see these little kids going, what? They cannot understand it. And then he begins to explain his background and how he grew up, and his own identity was really tied to the African American culture. And so then that gives rise to our next two words, which is ethnicity and culture. Ethnicity, and again, these words oftentimes are used interchangeably, and to completely distinguish between the two becomes difficult. I mean, you can do it from a definitional standpoint, but in actual practice, they tend to blur a little bit. Ethnicity tends to be more broad, and so you'll oftentimes hear about like ethnic connections to like an area or a region. So a lot of times, like within the Lutheran Church is a good example. You've got the German Lutheran Church, you've got the Swedish Swedish Lutheran Church, the Norwegian Lutheran Church, and those really reflect a deeper ethnicity. It tends to be bound by region, by language, broad aspects of it. Culture has some of the same things, but it can oftentimes be focused on a single thing. So, for example, you could you could identify with the broader ethnic group, but you actually may be only participating in a few of the cultural expressions of that. So, for example, my ethnic heritage is Norwegian, and I like lefse. Don't like lutefisk. Celebrated Christmas on Christmas Eve, which was a very Norwegian thing to do. And yet, I probably wouldn't consider myself, for a lot of my life, I really didn't consider myself ethnically Norwegian. Okay, because I didn't like identify as, I'm heart and soul, I'm Norwegian. And this is one of the challenges for whites in America, is because we oftentimes lose our ethnic identity, even if we may still have pieces of our cultural past, okay, that carry through. And I think this actually may lead into the next piece, yeah, so a little bit about our stories. So this is, so let me tell you a brief story about how actually I came to terms with my own Norwegian heritage. Back in 2000, I had the wonderful opportunity to take my family to Norway. I was a Fulbright scholar in Norway for a year. Great opportunity, one of the best things I've done in my life. And so when we were going over there, and I thought, well, this will be great, I'm going back to the homeland, right? I had no idea what the homeland was. Either than I was thinking, am I going to have to eat lutefisk? Because I've avoided it my entire life. I subsequently found out we eat way more lutefisk in the United States than they do in Norway. But anyway, so we're ready to go, and we end up finding a house in Oslo. And in Oslo, because of the taxes, oftentimes houses tend to be multi-family dwellings. And so we were moving into this house that had 3 separate living spaces. The main part, which was the family who owned it, a smaller little part where we were going to live, and then a basement apartment. So because of frequent flyer miles and Fulbright not paying for all of us to go over, My wife and my son were gonna have to come to Norway a week after we arrived. So, so I arrive in Norway and get to our place, and we're moving in. And like a dutiful husband that I try to be, I call up my wife that night and I said, well, we made it, we're in the house, it's all great. And she said, oh, that's so exciting. Have you met our neighbors yet? I said, no, you know, I haven't met them yet. I'm sure I'm gonna meet them soon. So the next day, get done with my day, call my wife that night. She comes back at some point and says, so what are our neighbors like? Well, I still haven't met them. I'm sure it's right around the corner, I'm gonna do it. Now, part of my reality is I'm an introvert. Some people would say aloof. I would just say I keep to myself. And so moving out of that kind of trying to introduce myself is not always the easiest thing for me to do. So day 3, call my wife, ask the question, I give her the same answer. Day 4, same question, same answer. Day 5, etc., etc. So we pick her up on a week later, and as we're driving back from the airport, she looks at me and she says, you still haven't met him, have you? I said, no, haven't met him yet. You know, I'm sure it's just, you know, just haven't had the opportunity. And so we arrive, we're moving everything in, and literally within 5 minutes, she looks out the window, and there's our neighbors out in the yard. They have a little, probably 12 to 15-month-old baby that's rolling around the grass. And my wife looks at me and she says, this is a perfect opportunity. They're out there, let's just go in. Okay. So I'm following along, and she goes up and starts talking to the wife, and so the husband and I are standing right next to each other, not saying a word. And after about 10 minutes, he kind of leans over and looks at me and he said, we have a saying in Norway, the best neighbors live 5 miles away. And I said, I'm home. I'm home. I found my people. So part of that, right, is that was in many ways a deep expression of who I was, and I actually didn't realize the depth of my Norwegianness until I actually got there and began to experience that. And I think one of the challenges for us in the States is how do we come to grips with our own identity around issues of race, class, gender, all this kind of stuff that these statements talk about. And how do they push us forward? Because it's all that's interrogation of the self is hard and uncomfortable work because it puts you face to face with some things that's not always easy. And Carol, are you gonna?
Yeah,
add to
I'm
that?
going to share an experience with a neighbor of mine. We lived in Granada Hills for several years, many years ago when my children were younger. And we lived on a flag lot. It was a lot with 2 houses off of a driveway in the neighborhood. And our next door neighbor was African American, and they had kids about the same ages as our kids. They had a pool, we had a pool. And so we kind of got together and gave the kids joint swimming lessons. We invited a teacher to the house, and they first did our pool and then their pool. And one time the kids got all wet when they were fooling around, and so we changed them, and I said, let's just hang the clothes up here to dry in the driveway where we had the garage door up, and you could, you know, put a hanger there to blow in the wind. And she said, oh no, she said, the neighbors will think badly of me. You let blacks into the neighborhood and they hang their clothes out. It was something I would have done without any hesitation, but she was very sensitive to the notion of people thinking well of her and thinking that she was a civilized person, where it gave me an insight into how hard she was trying to fit into the neighborhood. Now, maybe some of the rest of you have stories about fitting in or knowing, having a friend of a different race or culture that might have been having trouble fitting in. Just, do any of you have anything you'd like to share? Yes, Ron?
Our daughter was, our son-in-law was in graduate school in Georgia Tech, and our daughter was at Emory, and,
Atlanta.
in Atlanta, Georgia.
My son taught at Emory.
Oh, okay. And she wrote a paper which was accepted at the conference. Shows up at the speaker's breakfast, and they wouldn't let her in, because they said, well, you can't be Miss Wong,
Yeah, that's her married last
that's her
name.
married last
She didn't
name,
look
and they
like
were
her.
expecting
Because she's blonde
this,
and
this
white.
Chinese woman to be giving this paper at this conference. She eventually got in, had breakfast, gave her paper, and was well received. The national conference paper and that kind of thing.
Any
And
other
also,
stories?
well,
Yeah.
This
And
is
I'm-
not, oh.
Yeah,
I was gonna say, he's not telling the story. When they first went to Atlanta in the late nineties, someone threw a rock at their car. Because, you know, there's an
So
interracial
it
marriage.
makes couple.
This is in Atlanta in the late nineties.
Wow.
one of my
Stacy.
best friends at my last work, she said you know the famous Norman Rockwell painting, Ruby Bridges, where a little black girl is trying to walk into the white school, and there's tomatoes and being thrown in. It was this, you know, it's an amazing painting. She said that was her. And when she was little, her mom moved the family into a better neighborhood for better schools. And she went through a lot of experiences, including somebody marking in chalk Niger, and she said, "Mom, look, they spelled it wrong," which is who Stephanie is. So, yeah, she was always reaching out, so.
Jeff?
Anyway, I just remember when I was working at this place, data processing, anyway, it's like a little United Nations because it's not, you don't have to be English fluent. It's so nice to work in an environment like that, you know, it's all programming, mathematics, analytics, and it doesn't matter if you're wherever you come from or whatever your English language. Anyway, there was this woman who looked Chinese, her last name was Chinese, but she spoke with absolutely she sounded more American, quote unquote, than myself, because she, you know, grew up, but it was just, even though I knew better and I saw her face to face, it was like a dissonance there, you know, it's like subconsciously, she's not Chinese, you know, I mean, she sounds too, quote, American, unquote. But, I mean, I, you know, got over it, but it just struck me at first.
I think that's a really important point that you raise, and I think that a lot of times there are things that create dissonance in this, and what we have to be willing to do is to acknowledge that, and later on, as the statement says, the church is advocating a commitment to confession. And what does that confession look like when we're talking about these kinds of issues? This is hard because it's like, you know, I want to be expansive, I want to be open, I want to be this, I don't want to have these prejudgments, right? Which is another word for prejudice, right? I don't want that stuff, and yet it comes in partly because we've been socialized in some very deep ways that actually give rise to this. So how do we constantly stay vigilant around our own positions?
Another example, when I was in graduate school, I had a professor who had a really deep Southern accent, a stereotypical, if you will. And I just remember thinking, this guy can't have a PhD from Yale. He's like, this guy's like, a redneck Southerner. How come? Got these papers that he wrote and this and that and published here and there, and he's like, yeah, he's Southern. So I mean, that's like, you might call that a reverse prejudice, but it's just as much a prejudice as anything else.
No, very much, and my first university job was in Tennessee, East Tennessee. And,
They
and I had
thought
a.
you talked funny.
Yeah, that's right. First, they didn't think I talked funny, but one of the funniest stories related to exactly that was we had a young man live with us, and he was from Maryville, Tennessee, and every Saturday morning he would get up and he would say, "I'm going to walk down to the store to get me a soda." And so finally, I said to him, I said, "Randy, why don't you just say, I'm gonna walk to the store to get a soda? Why do you have to say I'm gonna walk to the store to get me a soda?" And he looked at it and he said, "Well, if I didn't say it that way, you didn't know if I was buying it for you or for me." And I thought, he got a really good point.
Last Sunday, I recommended a letter to the editor that I saw in the Star about white privilege that we hear a lot more about nowadays. And I went and found it again and brought it this morning. It's short. As a white person in America, I never thought much about white privilege. My life just seemed normal. But then I saw what happened to my non-white family and friends and realized I have rights that I take for granted that they often don't have. Here are a few. The right to be anonymous in public, the right to be judged on one's own actions, the right to receive the benefit of the doubt, the right to be taken seriously, the right to be believed, the right to be respected. And I hope that by being more aware of what we take for granted, we can all be more compassionate citizens. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting, some things that we don't think about. And Condoleezza Rice telling her story of growing up in, where was it? In the South, Alabama, last week, or 2 weeks ago at CLU. Just an amazing story. And there are lots of those, but anyway. And now, we don't like the way this discussion's going, so we're gonna leave, right?
Well, we better change the way it's going.
We have a water polo game, I'm sorry.
I thought maybe mothers-in-law French, a lot of people like that.
Mine is a completely different direction. I've always traveled all my life. First with my parents and then by myself, with joining different groups. And I took a teacher's tour and asked for a roommate to share the room. And I was given a black lady. She turned out to be one of the most brilliant girls that I've ever met. And she's written, in Pasadena, she had written the book about black history here in America. And she was telling me about some of there were black kids in her classroom, and they actually threw a potted plant at her, and broke the blackboard that she happened to be at that moment. That was blacks treating blacks. We stayed friends. We went all over South America. People would stare at us when we came out, in Brazil especially, when we came out of the same room. She knew the Spanish language, so that she knew what they were saying at that moment. And Portuguese is similar to Spanish. We kept in contact with each other, and we did Asia then together. And we just happened to be thrown together. We didn't know each other at all. But she was brilliant, and I loved that. So we got along great.
Sometimes those personal interactions, we learn from that to overcome
Her
some
husband
biases.
had committed suicide because the pressure was so strong on him. But she lived through it.
Julie.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, you heard me say earlier that I don't really identify with one culture, ethnic, but I think for me, I mean, especially in these times, I feel like my cultural group is my socioeconomic group more than anything else. And learning about what that means, thank goodness someone started opening our eyes to that. And with Martin Luther King, we went to a worship service in Westchester, and we were 5% white people there, but they talked about white privilege, and I just wanted to crawl under it hit me so, I was so ashamed but not ever knowing and not guilty because that was the culture I grew up in, right? And so it was just really, really good experience to get yourself outside of your comfort zone and to make those personal connections with people. And, but it's hard to break those socioeconomic barriers harder than a cultural, because that is the culture, it seems like, more than anything else here.
I wonder, Mike, if poverty is a bigger divider than race. What do you think about
So
that?
there was actually a book written back in the late 70s by a sociologist, and of course, what's his name? William Julius Wilson. And the title of the book was called The Declining Significance of Race. He got attacked for it because people felt like he was backtracking about the race question. Because even though we can say it's a socially constructed idea, that's not to say that it doesn't have an actual sociological effect too, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing. But his basic argument in that book was that socioeconomics was becoming a bigger factor within the United States. Now, I think there's some argument with that. I think there are two variables that have tremendous impacts on society, and whether one becomes more or less, I don't know. I would say they both have an effect, and a pretty profound effect at that. So.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how this, but the best church service I ever went to in my life, it was just amazing, was in Pacoima. It was Andre Crouch, which some of you who are him, he was a contemporary hymn writer or gospel writer, and he and his sister were pastors, and there was this church. This was like 2 weeks after President Obama got elected, and it was like a total electric rave-up thing, because almost everyone there was black, and they were just going crazy, and it was such energy, and it was like, they had the videos of the president, everything there, and then later on, this was amazing, it's hard to believe, there was a group of young children got on stage dressed in black, but they're like, quote, pure white, unquote, with blonde hair, and it turned out they were a visiting group from Norway,
Those
famous
Norwegians,
singing
they're
group.
everywhere.
And the contrast, it's like between this electric, absolutely charismatic black, and I just love that kind of worship. I love gospel, black gospel, and I love all that stuff, and it's just like amazing contrast. But it wasn't a dissonance like we've spoken of, but it was actually, everybody was respectful and nice to these young girls, and everybody was crazy with when they're supposed to be crazy, so it just was a marvelous, never forget experience.
You had a comment too.
I had a different kind of upbringing, and I don't know why exactly, but when I started kindergarten, there was a little girl that right away grabbed me up and we'd swing together. That lasted about a week, and then she was very pretty. And then everybody wanted to be her friend. And I, as first grade began, just picking out somebody that looked interesting to me. And that's it. First grade was Native American, I believe. Yes, Native American. And second grade was a French girl. These are people that kind of came in for a while. And third grade was Italian. And I actually choose it for my friend in the fourth grade too, and I used to go every Friday night for Italian food. I just loved it. And I loved all that, and that's the way I grew up. And then as an adult with children, I continued that and had different cultures. What's interesting to me is that the choice my children, my daughter married a man who is half black, and so their children are quarter black. And then my son married a woman who's from
Chile.
Chile. And so it just, has been a very rich life. I really enjoy people that are not just like me.
Well, now for some biblical perspectives on this. You have a sheet that we've handed out that's got a Bible study. We're not going to read all these passages, but I'd like to invite somebody to read a passage under the question of Jesus and the question of belonging. Is there somebody who would volunteer to read Mark 7:24-30? I've got it printed out here. Alan?
Mark, the 7th chapter, 24th through the 30th verse, says that it begins, Jesus honors a Syrophoenician woman's faith. Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone.
Yeah, I think the point of this reading and the rest of the readings under this section that you'll see, and again, if you have time to peruse some of these later, I think it'll be useful, is that Jesus came to serve not only the Jews. I mean, that was the tension in those days between Jews and really everybody else, labeled as Gentiles. And there were some of the early disciples who couldn't understand why he was not, why he wasn't just, he'd come to save the Jews, why isn't he just ministering to the Jews? And he, by example, showed that he was reaching out to the broader population at that time. And there's a section here under Jesus creating the inclusive banquet, reaching out to everyone. Will somebody read these passages for me? Okay, Ron.
From Luke. People will come from east and west, and north and south, and will take their places at the feast in the kingdom of God. Indeed, there are those who are last who will be first, and first who will be last. From Matthew. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Again from Matthew. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, he's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat.
Okay, so these are cultural practices that that arose during Jesus' ministry. Is, you know, why is he breaking bread with tax collectors and sinners? And I like the way there's always the tax collectors that are the evil. But again, this is to give the example that Jesus came to break bread with everyone and to reach out to everyone. The next section is on the opening of the New Testament church. The comparison here is of the story of the Tower of Babel, where people were divided by language. But if you compare that to what happens in the story of Pentecost, where people are called and gathered together no matter what tongue they speak in, whatever their language, it's the formation of the New Testament church. But that's sort of a brief rundown. Feel free to take this home and look up some of the other passages. Duvalaka time will kind of move on. We are now to a section called the Facing God, a time of vision, a time of confession, a time of commitment, and a time of spiritual crisis. Mike, would you like to address those?
Sure. So talking about a time of vision, I think one of the real challenges for a lot of us is, we're seeing some fairly significant demographic shifts, not only within our communities, but within society at large and around the world. I mean, they're talking about in Europe about the recolonization of Europe, right? That Europe went out, colonized all these people around the world, and guess what? The colonists are coming home, and that's creating some huge challenges for Europe. The same thing with the United States, in that even with tightening immigration policies, we continue to be the most, or close to the most diverse society in the world. And that creates certain challenges about how we get around each other in mutually embracing and inclusive ways. They're also right now talking about the massive urbanization of the world. People are moving into cities at a faster rate than has ever happened before. What's that going to do? Well, it's going to force a whole lot of people together, to be absolutely sure. What do we have? 22 million people in Southern California. Norway's got 4.5 million total, right? So I mean, it's just on the sheer scale of things, it creates these really interesting challenges. One of the things I wanted to relate in this happens to be over at Cal Lutheran. You may have read or heard that about 2 years ago, when I first arrived, Cal Lutheran got designated a Hispanic serving institution. Now that's big news for a Lutheran university, right? and an HSI is primarily based on enrollment, okay? So from that perspective, that actually shouldn't surprise us, right? I mean, just by being located in Southern California, you have to hit 25% of your student population of Hispanic categorization to enable to qualify for an HSI. But here's the question that Cal Lutheran's been trying to answer. It's one thing to be a Hispanic enrolling institution, like Cal Lutheran is. It's another question to become a Hispanic serving institution. And what does it mean to actually serve the people that are now coming in to our community? What does that mean for the kinds of practices that we engage in? What does that mean for the way that we reach out to parents or reach out to the various communities or the kinds of events that we have on our campus? It challenges the practice by which we become really fulfilling that idea of serving. And so within the Graduate School of Education, one of the ways that we've decided to address it is there's a method called cultural proficiency. And cultural proficiency is what's termed an inside-out approach. The idea being the only way that you're going to relate better to each other is by going deeper in your own stuff, right? Really understanding the things that hang you up, that get in the way of authentic relationships, that are biased, that are prejudicial, that are whatever. And we all have them. That's part of being human. But then how do we acknowledge those and move forward? And so this issue of time of confession. Now, I can't say I've gotten my entire faculty to confess yet. I'm working on it. But I think part of the idea behind confession is a little bit what we talked about earlier. It's like, how do you acknowledge those pieces within you that may actually be having, it doesn't even have to have a huge negative impact, but it may suggest to you that you're not quite as open-minded, quite as expansive as you'd like to be. I was telling my faculty the story the other day. I mentioned that the gentleman that I worked under at the University of Washington was retiring. He had been at the University of Washington for 49 years. And I was very proud to have been his very first research assistant when he created the Center for Multicultural Education. And so a couple weeks ago, I get invited to come back to the gala. So I go back, and it's a conference type setting, bringing back flashbacks, and it's got probably 250 or so people there. And the whole time, I'm feeling a little bit uneasy. And I was having a hard time putting my finger on what was making me uneasy. And I got a chance to congratulate Dr. Banks. Got to talk to him for about 30 seconds, which is about what you get with him. And I left that day, and I was meeting with some people that night, and I was telling them about the day, and they said, well, how was it? And I said, well, it was a little bit uncomfortable. And they said, well, why? And I said, I don't know, just I didn't feel, like I was fitting or whatever. Now, as you can imagine, the founder of Multicultural Education, that's a very diverse group of people. So first of all, I felt very out of place ethnically, racially, right? I was probably one of, 10 white guys there, okay? Now, I'm used to that because of the worlds that I've traveled in, but not in a full academic sense, because the academy tends to still be fairly white dominated. But then I also felt, which I didn't realize at the moment, but it came to me, is I thought I'd be recognized more, right? I was the first research assistant, and yet I was just another guy who was sitting there. And so this friend of mine finally, when I was and I didn't get that into deep, he actually saw it much quicker, and he said, oh, your pride got a little hurt, didn't it? And I said, doggone it, you're right. My pride did get a little hurt. Now, some of that had to do with, I'm convinced, my whiteness, right? My whiteness was actually giving rise to some of my pride. So how do we understand that, interrogate that, and then really confess that as we move forward and say, you know what, yeah, it's a bias, and that holds me back from a deeper understanding and appreciation of the people around me. When I begin to think about some of these issues, and I love the intersection of these issues with the faith, because I'm very deeply committed to Martin Luther King's idea of the sacredness of human personality, the idea that if everybody is created in the image of God, then everybody has to be sacred. That seems like a theoretical concept, but try and put that into practice. Because I guarantee you there are some people that it's hard to see as sacred. Because I know not everybody sees me as sacred all the time. And so when I begin to think about these issues and how the Lutheran Church has really tried to put that together in a statement about how the church stands, I'm emboldened by that. And I think we have a lot of work to do, obviously. But I think it can actually begin to push our conversations. And so one of the questions, that I would love us as in our final minutes here to think about is, how do we do that? How do we engage in these conversations that we have to acknowledge are not always going to be comfortable? Right? It's going to push uncomfortability. I've got a meeting tomorrow, in fact, where we're diving even deeper into the cultural proficiency work, and I'm already thinking, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable, right? And yet I know I have to do it. I have to do it for our faculty, I have to do it for our staff, and I have to do it ultimately for the students who go to Cal Lutheran. So how would you all envision that?
Well, I had the opportunity to study under Dr. Lindsay, cultural proficiency was during my time at CLU. And one of the things that always stuck with me after that is that idea that for so long we were, trying to be this melting pot and cultural assimilation was the goal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a negative to recognize someone's differences. So we're moving into this time where it's okay. And I think that's where it can be uncomfortable, like you said, to recognize that everyone's coming to the table with a different perspective, hopefully. And that's what creates lots of good work to happen and conversation to happen. But creating an environment that's safe to recognize differences and see value in them.
No, it just reminds me, the World Relief people and the Lutheran, they talk about accompaniment. You're not supposed to like go in there and say, we got all the answers, all you guys in Africa, just follow us.
Yeah.
And you were talking earlier, I'm going back to earlier about how do white people work in this field, in your field, without being either arrogant or some other kind of, I can't think of words sometimes.
Well, like privilege.
Patronizing
Yeah,
almost.
Yeah, totally.
Or I've got all the answers and all that, so kind of like, to me, there's a comparison there between accompaniment and, there's a cultural edge thing called cultural appropriation. Have you heard, you hear that, where people of a majority culture kind of like take elements, fun elements or exciting elements or distinctive elements of a minority or some other culture that they're not immersed in or they're not intimately familiar with, and use it to pump up their own production, so to speak, so.
Winston Churchill said that criticism is heartfelt but necessary, because it is it's like pain to the body. It's necessary in order to prove that there is something unhealthy going on. And that's one of the challenges that we have, is a lot of, I've gone to race, ethnic, and cultural sessions for over 50 years. The first one I went to was in Philadelphia 52 years ago with the Lutheran Church, the laity, and the church body. And the problem, as I see it, is that the letters are written and the policies are established at the level of administration, but for some reason it doesn't get down to the everyday working Christian like Alan Carter. It's like Alan can't embrace what the church is espousing. Theoretically, it's good, and Alan knows that it's good, but to be able to do that, how do I do that? That was a question asked. If you were privileged to live next door to a black man who was an attorney, or to a Hispanic man who was a gardener, whom would you prefer to live next to? And the answer resoundingly was the Hispanic man who's a gardener. Because there's a cultural divide that's so deep, so broad, so wide. When I see some of the things on social media that are said about minority people, it tells me how deep the divide is. We know intellectually and theoretically what Jesus professes and what he teaches us, but how do we do it? How do we do it? And one of the biggest problems that we have is in community. We are intimidated and we are constrained by the people in community, just as Peter was constrained by the Pharisees and he was afraid to sit and eat with the Gentiles, until the Apostle Paul said, "You hypocrite."
Right, right.
We're never going to get past it. We're never going to get past it until some Apostle Paul stands up and say, "You hypocrite."
Right.
And there are not enough Apostle Pauls that I've seen. There just aren't.
And I think Alan's touched on what I was actually hoping to hear more of in the class, and maybe more, I think warrants another session. I don't know if it's planned already, you know, that's great. If not, I think we should have it. And the deeper discussion about the divide, especially Christians who are not living out what Christ taught us. They're finding a way to merge or finding a way to justify their political beliefs through so-called Christian beliefs to support the bigotry and the racism and the hatred and the divide and the exclusiveness. And I think this was probably a good lead up to that deeper discussion, because that's one thing that weighs on my heart every single day. Every day I see it and I hear it, and it's just, my heart is sad, my heart is breaking, and what can we do about it? And so I think this is a good lead up to that deeper discussion that would probably be more like a 2 or 5 hour class, you know what I mean? Because it's so big, and how do you address that with fellow Christians? How do you address that with those who are outside the Christian church, who are viewing Christians in a different way these days? All you have to do is, I heard this in a Bible study while I was working at Thrivent, when the guy that started the devotional said he had recently searched, just pulled up a Google search and started typing in the words, "Why are Christians so?" And you know how Google automatically suggests fills for it? And the stuff that comes up as suggested finishes to that statement are frightening and disgusting and shameful. And so that's what I would like to see, how I would like to see the discussion go further, is how to address all of that as Christians and be a light to the world, to overshadow those Christians who are setting a bad example for the rest of the world.
Amen.
I brought Carol some magazines. I subscribe to 2 magazines. One of them is Sojourners, and the other is Christianity Today. And they've had a series of articles on racism and the confession that we need to make as a country about that. As a pastor with the social statements, we have not done a good job. A lot of times the first time a congregation sees a social statement is when there's a conflict. So when the social statement on sexuality came out, I was in a parish, and people were saying, "Well, what happened? Where did this come from?" I said, "It's been in discussion for a decade." And we went through it. I have to honor the congregation. After it came out, we went through it clause by clause. You can spell clause 2 ways. And there were some people who had the clause. And they actually left the congregation.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a social statement going on in draft right now that I would expect that most people here we're not even aware of, much less read, and we're gonna get to that next week.
Next
So
week,
a little
we're
segue for you.
And kind of in closing, I'm going to build on Laura's comment here, that if you look at the social statement itself, it's urging us to take leadership in this area, not only in our church, but in the greater public. What would it mean for us to demonstrate public leadership, and how might we confront racism in our communities, not only in our church, but in our communities? How might we witness? How might we become a public witness? And how can we foster the further conversations, the deeper conversations, that more than we can do in just 1 hour here? And what are the steps that we could take to become an advocate for members of our community? And just in closing, just a reminder that
We are to love our neighbor, our homeless neighbor, our gay neighbor, our Muslim neighbor, our black neighbor, our immigrant neighbor, our Jewish neighbor, the addicted neighbor, the Christian neighbor, the atheist neighbor, and the disabled neighbor. So our neighbor is very broad, and how do we reach that goal of loving our neighbor? So thank you for coming today. I don't want to keep you from your Mother's Day brunch.